One day closer to Halloween. But until then, you'll just have to settle for the shivers you get right here on Cozy Horror. With me, Dr. Plague. Welcome, one and all, to another day of our Halloween Cozy Horror. Let's get you started with something special. A tale from everybody's favorite grandpa about something that goes bump in the night. Let's start our cozy horror off right with Night Knockers. This year, we had a rare treat for Halloween. Instead of a white Christmas, we had a white October 31st instead. 3 days before Halloween, the region had a terrible blizzard roll through, covering everything in an early season snow. It did little to dampen the spirit of the trick-or-treaters, though. We definitely saw some costumes with thick pants and coats. Grandpa and I sat bundled up on the front porch, passing out candy as we always did, and Gramps was in high spirits. He had finally kicked the cough that had kept him down most of the summer, and as I watched him handing out sweets, I hoped he wasn't going to have a flare-up again. We still had plenty of the stuff they gave us for the breathing machine, but getting him to take it was like pulling teeth. He noticed me watching him and rolled his eyes at me. "Don't worry, son. If I start feeling peaky, I'll go inside. Let me have my fun. Who knows how many more Halloweens an old man like me has in him." He smiled as he said it, turning back to fill the bags of shivering kids with treats. But we both knew there was honest dread behind those words. There would indeed come a day when there was no grandpa to fill the bags of the kiddos with the best the Walmart candy aisle had to offer. And I kinda hoped I wouldn't be around to see that day either. This place just wouldn't be the same without Grandpa to make it home. The moon was round and full as it shone over the porch, and as the last of the trick-or-treaters crunched through the snow, we headed back inside with a decidedly empty bowl. "Not bad for a snowbound Halloween," Grandpa commented, pouring the last of the candy into the bowl by the door that he kept for guests. "I was surprised that so many came out," I commented, locking the door and running the chain. "I thought for sure that the snow would keep them away." "Peh, not a chance," Grandpa laughed, the toilet flushing as he finished his business. "Mountain kids won't miss out on free candy for anything. They've got too much Halloween spirit for that." I had turned to agree with him when a slow and ominous knock swung me back towards the door. It seemed odd, that knock, though I couldn't have told you why. It wasn't the quick and happy knock of a late-night treater. It wasn't the knock you heard from a kid at all. This was the slow and ominous drone of thick knuckles on wood, the low pounding of someone who hadn't had a good night's sleep in years. I looked through the frosted glass on the front door, but the knocker was a hazy outline in the semi-opaque screen. It was adult-sized and man-shaped, but even looking at it made me shudder. The posture reminded me of a corpse, and despite my internal radar pinging like a fish finder, I found I was still reaching for the knob. My numb fingers had reached for the chain when those knuckles dropped lazily against the door again. At long last, it hit me as the chain came sideways, the metal scraping eerily, what those bones sounded like as they rattled the door. I had never heard the noise before, but it had to be an exact match. I tried to resist the pull of courtesy, the draw of hospitality that came from a lifetime with my parents. For my better judgment knew that something terrible lay on the other side of that door, and it would be better to leave it in the cold and the snow. The rapping of those knuckles sounded like fingers drumming on a coffin lid, and I knew without a doubt that this visitor was not of this world. Grandpa caught me by the wrist as my hand closed around the knob, and I was very glad that he had. "Don't open that door. That's not a guest you want in here." The knock came a third time as we stood deliberating, and when it turned slowly from the door and walked away, I breathed a sigh of relief. "Don't celebrate just yet," Grandpa said, putting the chain back up and drawing me away from the door. "It's only just beginning now." "What is?" I asked, not even asking how he knew it was malicious. That had been no straggling trick-or-treater. I'd felt it through the door, but still I felt obligated to offer it hospitality. When someone knocked, after all, and especially when it was cold out, you let them in. It was polite, if not a little foolish on my part. "A night knocker," Grandpa said. "They usually only come on snowy winter nights, but I suppose a restless spirit on Halloween is fitting somehow." "Night knocker?" I asked, jumping a little as a new knock came from the back door. Through the glass, I could see the shadowy figure lurking, and the light from inside the house did little to illuminate it. He raised his hand to knock a second time, and the glass shivered under the bony tonk, tonk, tonk of his gnarled old fist. "Wandering spirits who try to gain entry into a home. Night knockers used to be a profession of sorts, or so I've heard, and I imagine that more than one of them has likely tricked their way into a home that's used to answering a deputy checking for unlocked storefronts. They used to work for the sheriffs in rural areas, checking doors and locking up behind forgetful shopkeepers. But these fellas are a little less altruistic." It finished its third knock while we were gabbing, and I heard it move off across the back porch, back towards the woods. "It's not done yet, boy," Grandpa said, taking the kettle from the sink, and, as if he had conjured it, the thing tapped on the window in the living room, hard enough to rattle the frame. You've encountered them before, then?" I asked, turning to look in the direction of the knocker. "A few times. They aren't very common, but they appear now and again. Don't pay them any mind, boy. If they think you're scared of them, they tend to stick around longer." He added hot cocoa to the kettle, along with milk and some cinnamon, and put it on the stove as he switched the burner on. "Grandma told me about them when I was younger. Said they gave her a real fright when she was around my age. Have I ever told you that story?" he asked, grinning as he slid me a chair. "I suppose I haven't, or you would have known about the night knockers. It appears we have some time for a story, if you'd like to hear it." I nodded, watching as Grandpa stirred some honey into the pot and poured us each a cup full of the contents as it began to bubble. The knocker had moved onto the front porch again, tapping at the window with its stony old knuckles, and as he moved around the house to find more windows within reach, Grandpa took a testing sip of his hot chocolate. I found mine to be perfect. Not too sweet, but also not too hot. But Grandpa must have not approved of his. He took another spoon of the mix and stirred it in, smacking his lips as he tasted it this time. "Perfect. Now where was I? Oh, yes. It was a night much like this, and I was staying with my grandma during a frosty January blizzard. My parents had gone out of town, sort of a second honeymoon for their 11th wedding anniversary, and Grandma and I were spending a night together in her little cabin. A storm had blown up about a week after my parents left, and by the second week we were well and truly snowed in. Why they had decided to take a trip right after Christmas was beyond me, but school was canceled, and it was just Grandma and I on our own. She'd laid in food for the winter, like she always did, and we were eating stew and fresh bread when a knock came on the door. It wasn't a knock of a normal person, though. It was slow and rhythmic, like someone just letting their fingers fall against the wood. I don't know how anyone could be out in this weather, but as I rose to answer the door, Grandma stopped me. "Don't," she said, getting up to check the lock before closing the curtains on the window. "But what if it's someone who needs help?" I asked, worried they'd freeze out there. "It isn't," she said. "It's no one that you can help anyway." "What do you mean?" I asked, getting a little scared as the knocking sounded again against the nearby window. "It's a night knocker," she said, "a restless spirit that wanders and looks for people to let it in." What does it do to them?" I asked, my voice higher than usual as my terror crawled up my throat. "No one really knows. The ones who do don't live long enough to talk about it." She saw that her words really weren't much of a comfort and switched gears. "Luckily for you, it's only one. When I was about your age, I had a whole bunch of them come to your great-grandmother's house while I was there alone. Would you like me to tell you about it?" She'd gone to the wood stove and put on some tea, the kettle already thumping as the water got good and hot. She didn't have any cocoa, very few people did around here at that time, but she had ginger tea and warm honey, and soon she had a cup of it in my shivering hands and was beginning her own story. The knocker was moving from window to window, testing each with his bony knuckles, but as she started her own story, I almost forgot about him. It was March, and Mama had gone out to try to get some supplies. Daddy had been stuck in the mines for about a week, snowed in as the site was waist-deep in powder, and Mama and I were on our own. The food had begun to run low, and Mama had left to see if anything in town was open so she could pick up some supplies. We'd boiled the last of the oats for breakfast, and the kettle of soup we had made from the ham and remaining vegetables was down to the bottom of the pot. Mama had left around noon, saying she'd be back before dark, but dark had come, and Mama was still gone. The fire had cast my grandmother in a ghostly cloak, and as I caught in the spell of her story, she laid out the perils of her snowbound home to me. This wasn't the first time I had been home alone, far from it, and I was busy preparing the middlings of what we had set aside for dinner. There was only a few eggs and some grits left for breakfast, and after that we'd be down to eating the shoe leather. I was adding to the small soup stock we had, mostly boiling vegetables, when someone knocked at the door. I thought it was my mother, and I had my hand around the knob before I was hit with the most overwhelming sense of dread. I had learned from my mother about the unseen world and was acutely aware of its presence, even at 11. I heard it knock again, and it took all my will to remove my hand from the doorknob. Not only was I drawn by the pull of generosity and custom, something that runs deep here in Appalachia, but there was an undeniable draw to let whatever it was in. After the third knock, it moved away, and as the pull dwindled, I breathed a sigh of relief. When another knock came at the door, mirrored by a similar knock at the window, I jumped in surprise and looked over at the window that looked out from the den. There was a man-sized shape there, its fist raised to knock again, but the dimensions were wrong. It was like a living shadow, the thickness seeming temperamental, and when it moved away after the third knock, another took its place and knocked again. Now there were 3 of them, knocking at the windows and the door. They were circling the house, and as they knocked, I felt my breath hitching as my panic rose. It was like an ever-expanding circle, the knocking moving around and around and around. I thought maybe it would stop when they had enough to knock on all the windows and doors, but then others began to tap on the walls and on the roof, too. The clamor was too much. I put my hands over my ears as I prayed to God to make it stop. As I stood there sobbing, asking the Almighty to help me, though, the voice of my own grandmother echoed in my head. "The good Lord helps those who help themselves, Junebug. You have the tools, you have the knowledge, so don't bother that man with your trouble. He's got bigger fish to fry." I realized that she was right, and I began to chant a little spell my mother had taught me. It rolled off my tongue like warm tea, and as it did so, the knocking began to decrease in volume. Suddenly, they were no longer banging on the roof. Then the knocking on the walls stopped. Slowly, the knockers on the windows dispersed, and finally, the two on the doors ceased as well. It was so quiet, so still, that when a single knock came at the door, I screamed like a tea kettle and nearly dropped in fright. Junebug, it's Mama. Open the door, Junebug. I've got groceries, and the snow has my feet numb." I cried with joy. It was Mama. She was back, and when I gripped the knob, I felt nothing but the love and worry that she had for me. I threw my arms around her, tears streaming down my face as I told her what had happened. She came inside, locking the door and saying she was sorry for being so late. She had made it to town and got the groceries, and when Mr. Argy offered her a ride in his wagon, she thought for sure that she'd be home before dark. Only I must have gotten turned around after I got out the foot of the mountain, 'cause the next thing I knew I was nearly tumbling into Mr. Goldway's holler. We unpacked the groceries, and then she made tea and explained the night knockers to me. After that, I felt a lot better, and I suspect that you do as well. As I drank my tea and listened to her story, I realized that the knocking had stopped. Grandma had distracted me with a story long enough for the knockers to get bored and leave on their own. I kept an ear out for them after that, but I never forgot the power of stories when one is under great emotional stress. I sipped my cocoa as Grandpa finished and realized he had done the same for me. I didn't know when the knocking had stopped, but the only sound in Grandpa's house was the sound of the clock as it ticked the evening away. "I guess telling stories is something that runs in the family," I said, finishing my cocoa before going to wash the cup in the sink. I didn't have to see Grandpa smile to hear it in his voice when he said, "We won't know till you have some grandchildren of your own, I suppose." I poured another cup of cocoa and sat sipping at it as I listened to the wind blow and the snow powder around the house, glad to be inside with Grandpa on this wonderful evening with his wonderful tales. From Grandpa's house to ours, we wish you a very happy Halloween. You can always count on Grandpa to bring the best stories. Moving from Appalachian Grandpa to the laughing audience, let's hear a story about something that's hard to do. Let's hear about someone who laughs in the face of fear. Trick or treat! Anne smiled down at the trio of kids on her front porch, dropping a fistful of candy into each of their waiting bags. "Don't you look cute? Happy Halloween!" They had come as the Avengers. A Hulk, a Thor, and a Captain America gathered on her doorstep in search of treats. Anne had seen a lot of different groups, even a few singles, but all of them had complimented her on her elaborate yard decor. As the three superheroes gushed about how cool it was, too, she smiled and gazed out at what she had created this year. She gazed at her kingdom, but she couldn't help but look fretfully around for the shadows that had plagued her for the last few weeks. Anne had sunk a lot of time into her yard display over the years, and she hated that this year's display had a pall cast over it. Anne's yard displays were always the talk of the neighborhood. She'd spent years collecting things for each season, and as she looked across the yard of foam tombstones, moving zombies, flashing ghosts, and a nearly 20-foot-tall moving skeleton that her nephew had helped her rig up, she was pretty happy about how her graveyard had turned out. That was to say, nothing about the fog machines that added ambience to the place, and the motion sensors that brought a few of the undead screaming from their graves when someone walked too close. Despite her trepidation, Anne realized that she was already planning the additions to next year's Halloween layout. She still had plenty of black foam and spray paint, not to mention all that acrylic paint from the craft room. She could make a mausoleum to go with the graveyard, maybe even a few open caskets to dot the yard. Anne had been retired for nearly a decade by now, and it was nothing for her to spend days out in the shed as she fabricated decorations for this holiday or that holiday. The thought of going back into that workshop now, though, made the hair stand up on her neck. But she knew that she would. Anne wouldn't let anything stop her from what she loved most. She set out a spread for every holiday, that was true, but she saved her best work for Halloween. Halloween had always been special to Anne. Her mother had begun setting up their yard on September 30th every year for as long as she could remember, and her mother's spread had always been something to see. Growing up in a strictly religious family, Anne's mother had never been allowed to celebrate Halloween. I watched from the front window every year as the other kids went by in their colorful costumes and longed to be a part of it. Now, I make up for lost time by having the best yard and the best costume, she always declared proudly. She wasn't wrong either. Anne's mother was always the envy of the cul-de-sac, and her daughter had certainly taken after her in that aspect. She poured so much effort into her decorations, and as one of the kids jumped at a rising zombie, she knew that the first place prize in the best yard contest would be hers again this year. She heard the chuckling to her left, the sound rankling her as she turned to see who had snuck up on her. Who was laughing? No one should be laughing. Screaming, running, jumping with surprise. These were the things that her decorations inspired. The only laughing should come after the scare, and the chuckle then should be relieved and full of silent thanks that it had been a trick. This laughter, though, it had been merry, downright robotic, and she would see who had dared to chortle at her expert display. She felt the familiar stab of fear at the sound of that laughter too, because it was the laughter that had ultimately run her from the workshop. She had been so busy preparing for Halloween that she had nearly put it off as a trick of the nerves. She'd been working since August on this year's display, and between the tombstones and the countless undead she wanted to make, she'd been pulling 12-hour days in the workshop. This was going to be her best year yet, better than her Hansel and Gretel gingerbread house, better than her ghost pirate crew, better than her haunted corn maze even. This year, she was going all out, and she had nearly broken the bank doing it. So, when the little chuckle began to echo from the depths of the workshop, Anne had put it down to too much coffee and not enough sleep. Then she began seeing things from the corner of her eye. Just little things at first. Shadows, skittering shapes that never quite materialized. But she shook these megrims away as well. They were nothing. She would finish the graveyard and start on the scarecrows for her Thanksgiving display. She would finish ahead of schedule, start putting the corn and pumpkins and turkey up the day after Halloween, and go along as she always had. But then, as she worked late one night, she finally saw what had been dogging her steps and had yet to return to the workshop. She had heard the laughter as she was shaving another inch off the last gravestone, and looked up to see a grinning shade crouched in the corner of the little building. It was closer than she had expected, nearly in biting range of those massive teeth, and the tombstone had made a hollow thunk as it fell off the bench. She had scuttled towards the door, her heart racing as the undulating shade took a step towards her. It loosed that canned laughter again, its mouth opening like a snake's mouth as the shadow split like oil, and she had slammed the door shut behind her, locking it with the key as she ran for home. She had finished up the last tombstone in the kitchen, and had been thankful that all the zombies were stacked on the back porch. Now, however, there was no door to slam, no lock to run, and it was just her and the intruder that was hunched on her porch railing. Standing on the rail, watching her from beneath a tatty, yellowing bedsheet, was a little ghost. The kid couldn't be more than 7 or 8. He was so small, but as it looked at her, the wind pushing the hem of the sheet a little, Anne felt a shudder run through her. It was as if a goose had walked over her grave, and as she tried to form some kind of greeting, explanation, or anything in between, she found her thoughts sucked away like cows in a whirlwind. "Wow, Miss Anne, your graveyard looks amazing!" Anne cut her eyes back to the front and saw Debbie Garrison walking her too big Toto up the walkway as the hem of her Dorothy costume bounced merrily. She was smiling like she'd never seen the place before, and jumping in surprise whenever something rose up to startle her. Anne couldn't help but smile as she waved at the girl's mother, still back on the sidewalk with Debbie's 8-month-old brother, and when she looked back to the little ghost, it was gone. "Just a bit of Halloween mischief, I suppose," Anne said, picking up her bowl as she went to go greet Dorothy and her very large dog, too. The Garrison's black lab was all wagging tail and lolling tongue, and Debbie was giggling madly as the big lug pulled her towards the porch for pets. Anne obliged, scratching him behind the ears as he liked to have, and tossing him a popcorn ball as she filled the little girl's bag with treats. Debbie lived at the end of the cul-de-sac, and when it came time to sell chocolates or magazines or just somewhere to sit and gawk at the pretty decorations, Debbie seemed to always come here first. She was the closest thing Anne felt like she'd ever have to a daughter or a granddaughter, and she was glad the little girl had come for her yearly candy haul. "Did you get a lot of candy this year, Debbie?" Anne asked as she emptied the bowl into her sack. "I sure did, Miss Anne. Mommy and me went all over, but I wanted to come here last so I could see your cool decorations." Anne smiled. "I'm glad you did. Here," she said, shaking the other bowl over her bag. "I think you'll be my last trick-or-treater for tonight." Debbie gasped. "But Miss Anne, what if the other kids come for treats?" "I don't think they will. It's almost 9, and the other houses are starting to shut off their porch lights. If any latecomers show up, I guess they'll have to come early next year," she said with a wink. Debbie smiled, but Anne saw it morph into an O of surprise as she looked past her. "What about that one? Is he a friend of yours, Miss Anne?" Anne turned, but she could already hear the growl coming from the oversized Toto. She already knew what she would see there, and the dirty ghost child didn't disappoint. He was standing between her and the door now, hunkered over on all fours like an animal, as that soft chuckle rose in him like a cricket at dusk. Every hair was standing up on the dog's back, his hackles high as he prepared to charge. If he did, the little girl would likely be hurt, and when Anne stepped up next to her, it was as much for the protection of the dog as to hold on to its lead. "Debbie," her mother called, oblivious to what was going on a few feet away. "Come on, honey, it's getting late. Your brother's ready for bedtime." Anne had looked away for only a second, but as she turned back, she heard the growling dog become confused as the little ghost vanished back to wherever it had come from. "Miss Anne?" Debbie asked. "What's wrong? Totoro, why are you growling?" Nothing, Anne said, fixing her smile back into place. "You two run along now. We wouldn't want to keep your mother waiting." She turned, putting her back to the door, but as she waved, that laughing crept up her spine like cat paws. Anne had never been afraid within the circle of protection provided by this cul-de-sac, let alone in her own yard. But what she wanted most at that moment was to turn tail and leave with Debbie and her mother. It would be unthinkable to leave her home, a home her mother had tended so lovingly. And as she turned again to face the laughter, she was greeted by an empty porch. She didn't know what this was, what sort of spirit was haunting her home, or why, but she was less than self-conscious as she ran up the stairs and through the front door, locking all 3 locks behind her. She suddenly found that she didn't care if she had any last-minute trick-or-treaters. Anne flipped the switch and turned her porch light off, letting them know that she was done passing out candy for the night. With her back against the door, she heard the scamper of bare feet as they pattered across the porch. But to her horror, it sounded like more than a single pair. It appeared her little shadow had friends, and Anne hoped that her door would be enough to hold them. She thought about calling the police, but what could they do against spirits? Her best option was to sit in the house and keep the door between them and her. Outside, she could hear something setting off the motion detectors, the hollow sound of zombies groaning as they popped up, and reached over shakily to the extension cord by the door. That was easily fixed. She'd unplug it. Then they couldn't set off anything. She could sit in here, safe and sound, and they could just scamper around out there till they got enough of it. If they were spirits, then they couldn't just come in without an invitation. They'd be gone by first light, and that was how ghosts worked, right? When the sun rose and Halloween was over, they could go back to their world and leave her alone. When something crashed in the yard, however, Anne realized that she might have underestimated them. She peeked out her window and saw that the huge skeleton she had set up had fallen over, and her yard was now a shamble of broken gravestones and splintered wooden zombies. The skeleton had been heavy, but she hadn't realized it was that heavy. Her hand was on the knob, ready to go out and defend her precious decorations, but she froze there as she thought better of it. She couldn't do anything to them, not really, and she could always make more decorations. It hurt to lose them, some of them having been with her for years, but she was more afraid of the shades than she was mad about the destruction. When the chuckling came right up to the door again, she backed away as if the wood might bite her. "Come out! Come out! We need your skill." The voice was thin, whispery, like mice feet on wax paper, but even within the words, she could hear that canned laughter. The sound of it made her skin crawl. "I won't," she said, her words choked with sobs. "I won't come out. You can't make me. Just leave me alone." She hadn't been this scared since she was a child, and the realization made it even worse. The laughter was like something out of a mental health ward. It was like the laughter that bubbles from the depths of hell. When it was cut off by the barking of a dog, she heard it swivel as if they were turning to see what had brought it on. "Miss Anne?" came a cherubic voice. "Miss Anne, are you okay? I was taking Totoro out to do his business when I heard a loud noise. Miss Anne, are you all right?" The laughter was merry, gleeful, as they discovered they had another toy to play with. "No matter," they lilted. "We'll just Take her instead." The feet darted from the porch, and when Debbie screamed, it was cut off suddenly by a small and hesitant laughter. Anne felt her breath hitch as it grew in volume. The girl moved to merriment by the laughing shadows. No, not Debbie. They could take her serenity, her security, and her decorations. They could invade her yard and her workshop, but she wouldn't let them have that little girl. She was out the door and onto the porch as the laughter took on a choking quality, and she could see both Debbie and the lab lying on the sidewalk and writhing with laughter. Debbie was clutching her throat and gasping for air, trying to breathe past the laughter and failing. The dog, the one with the odd name she could never remember, well, she had never heard a dog laugh before, and it was clear that the vocal cords of the animal were not set up for it. It made a soft, chuffing sound, like sneezing but higher pitched, and it too seemed to be struggling to breathe. The shadows that stood crouched around her looked up when Anne shouted at them, and their smiling, gleeful faces made her all the madder. "Stop it! Stop it! Stop hurting them! Leave her alone, and I'll do whatever you want. Take me instead, but leave her alone. She's just a little girl. She has her whole life ahead of her. Stop it!" Anne was crying by then, fat, ugly tears that ran down her face. But when one of the creatures lifted her chin with a dark finger, she felt a chuckle bubble up through the sorrow, like water from deep within the earth. "Come with us, then. We need your help," it rasped. My help?" she said, the laughter becoming infectious. "Yes. We will need sets and costumes for the show. You will find your talents are in high demand." Debbie had stopped laughing, lying so still on the sidewalk that Anne thought she might be dead, until she saw her breathing. She nodded, getting up as the laughter gripped her like a fist. She went laughing into that dark place, and her disappearance was quite the neighborhood mystery for years to come. It seemed that the gallery got their trick-or-treat that year, and they were merrier for it. I do so love to hear a good laughing audience story. But if there's a story I like hearing more, it's a story from our good friend the Barker and his holiday exploits. So let's hear one now about a man who was taken by the bottle. "I don't care, Melinda. I've been dry for weeks, and I'm ready to be satisfied." Melinda grabbed at him as he left the apartment, telling him to stay with the program. But Clarence wouldn't hear any of it. Clarence had been on the wagon for about 2 months, and it had been the worst 60 days of his life. They had told him it would be. They had explained that alcohol was one of the hardest things to kick, but he hadn't understood at the time. He'd been recovering from a bad car accident, and the painkillers had been keeping him high. He had agreed with Melinda that it was time to stop drinking, time to stop the cycle that had gripped his family for years. How Melinda had managed to come out with nothing but scrapes, while he had shattered his collarbone, was beyond him. But she had taken it as a sign to lay off the hooch. She followed him down the stairs to their apartment, begging him to come back inside. It was a week before Halloween, and the bars would be rotten with possibilities. 2-for-1 pumpkin shots, half-price witch's brew, pumpkin chugging, and all the trendy crap they used to get the college kids and hipsters into their dive bars. For pros like Clarence, it was all beer, and it was all good for him right now. She stopped at the door as he hit the streets, looking around like she thought a bottle of wine might attack her before making one last plea. "Clarence, please come back in. We'll do anything you want. We'll watch a movie or make brownies or... She looked around with embarrassment. I'll go to bed with you right now, but please don't do this. Clarence had already won. Melinda had become a real prude once she put the bottle down, and the thought of stepping onto the sidewalk in her nightgown filled her with a dread and embarrassment more palpable than any scary movie. She wouldn't come after him. It was unthinkable, and he felt completely comfortable turning back to throw one last barb her way. What I want, Millie, is to drink. So unless you got a bottle of Johnny Walker under your nightgown, I'm going to the bar. She cried for him until he'd rounded the corner, and likely went on crying after that, but he couldn't hear her once the apartment door was out of sight. It had been easy for her. Melinda hadn't really started drinking until she'd met Clarence. The two had met in high school, Melinda a shy new girl, and Clarence the teenage delinquent sliding towards burnout. Clarence had been better at hiding it then, and Melinda's parents had been pleased with her new suitor. Behind the scenes, Melinda had played with alcohol and drugs for the first time in her life, and Clarence was careful not to let her burgeoning problem become known to her parents. It was easier for her to give it up. Alcohol was Clarence's life. The drugs had been the icing on the cake. Clarence had never done more than smoke a little dope or take some pills if offered, but the drink had taken him early. Clarence had been part of a big old third-generation Irish Catholic family, his great-grandfather having stumbled off the boat in 1916, only to stumble back onto another one as they sent him off to fight in World War I. To hear Grandpa tell it, he'd stayed drunk for the next 3 years until it was time to come home, and he'd come back to find his 4 kids bigger, his wife fatter, and a new bottle to slide into. Alcohol has lubricated our forebears for years, boyo. It's probably what you owe your very existence to, his grandfather had told him often, and always with a wink. When Clarence thought back on his old man, he could see what his grandfather had meant. Clarence Sr., though nobody called Clarence Jr. if they liked their teeth in their mouth, had been a mean drunk. He'd spent most of Clarence's life beating him, beating his sisters, beating his brothers, and beating his mother whenever he wasn't working at the cannery. The family was happy, right up until Clarence Sr. came home about 8:30 and yelled drunkenly for his dinner. The kids knew that if you wanted to walk the next day with both eyes unblackened, then you better get to your room and sleep under the frame. Their mother tried her best to mitigate the damage, but inevitably someone would wander out for the bathroom or to get something forgotten and become the subject of Clarence Sr.'s ire. Clarence Jr. had taken up drinking early, sneaking a mason jar of whiskey into his room when he was just 7 years old after a particularly bad beating from his old man, and the rest was history. It was easy for Melinda to give up the drink. It wasn't part of her, like it was for Clarence. "Excuse me, sir," came a cry from his left, and Clarence jumped as a man who looked more at home in the center ring of a circus stepped out beside him. He was in the alley that usually took Clarence from the street to the back of Papa's Tavern, and the haunted house had been built right in front of his shortcut. "Would you like to take part in a truly terrifying experience?" Clarence looked up and found something akin to a middle school class's haunted house. The outside was a giant paper pumpkin with its mouth open and lolling to admit any who were brave enough to enter. 2 spotlights likely played hell with the local airport, and the sign out front promised a terrifying experience or your money back. The whole thing looked more comical than scary, and it was pretty obvious that the barker, a man in a circus coat and top hat, was trying to fleece drunks and those who like to undertake seasonal attractions. Clarence rolled his eyes and started to just walk around, but he soon realized that All he had to do was drop a couple of bucks in the box, then come back after a drink or 5 and say that he hadn't been satisfied. It was a great plan. He could tie a few on, walk right back out the back, get his money back, and go home satisfied. "Sure. How much?" $5, said the old man, shaking a money box under his nose. "And a refund is guaranteed if not completely satisfied." Clarence rolled his eyes and dropped the money in. He stepped through the pumpkin mouth and was immediately bombarded with the smoke from a fog machine. He coughed, hating these things more than the mealy taste in his dry mouth. But when he cleared it away and made it inside, he thought he might have taken a wrong turn. The low lights, the smell of old booze, the wonky sound of a juke that had been hit one too many times, even the tinkle of the bell as he stepped fully inside. Clarence was in Papa's. He looked behind him, but it was the same door he'd come in through so many other times. The multicolored glass on the wooden front door held a swinging bell to alert the owner of guests, and as it stopped ringing, he heard Pap greet him like he always had. Clarence breathed in the familiar smell of cigarette smoke and spilled beer as he approached the bar, feeling an odd sense of homecoming in those ancient aromas. The same barflies hung around in shadowy alcoves, offering him nods or waves, but he couldn't see much beyond the lingering murk around them. "Long time no see, boyo," Pap said, and as he called him boyo, Clarence thought the old bartender looked a little bit like his grandpa. "What'll it be this evening?" Clarence shook his head. "Well, Pap, I think I'm going to start off with a whiskey and—" "Coming right up," the old bartender said, slamming a huge glass jug onto the counter. It was huge, like a jug of hobo wine, and Clarence could see that it was full of amber fire. It would have to be way more than Clarence had on hand, maybe more than he had in the bank. But as the smell hit him from the little plug hole, he knew that he had to have it, even if it was only a single sip before it was taken away. He had to have that first long sip. "Where's the glass, Pap?" he asked, looking up to find Pap was no longer there. The Bag-o-Bones bartender in the greasy apron and dirty undershirt had been replaced by his grandfather. "No glasses, boyo. It's all for you, and it's on the house." He tilted his own bottle then, and Clarence winced as his lips stuck noisily in the plug hole before pulling free. "Gramps?" Clarence asked, not sure what was going on. "Aye, what's wrong, boyo? You look as though you've seen a ghost." Clarence was indeed seeing a ghost. His grandfather had died when he was 16, and it had been the greatest loss of his life. He'd been living with Gramps by then, his dad becoming intolerable after his mother had died a few years before. Most of his siblings were also living with relatives by then, the ones who were old enough to get away, and it had been the best times of his life. He shared his time between Melinda's house and his grandfather's home, and when he came back to find the old man dead after a weekend with his girlfriend and her family, he had fallen to pieces. To see him now, alive and hale, was enough of a shock to put him in the grave. I don't know," he said, his hands shaking as he reached for the bottle. He'd never needed a drink so much in his life. He suddenly needed to blink and see Pap and his toothless, filthy self standing before him as if to ask if he'd been on the bad stuff again. When the bottle grated harshly against the tabletop, and Clarence still hadn't snapped out of it, he realized this was actually happening. I saw your body, Gramps. I watched him put you in the earth. You can't be here," he stammered, as the old man smiled at him knowingly. "And why wouldn't I be? This is where all the old fish go when they've drunk their last tank." He swigged from the bottle again, and when he smacked away from it, his lips looked stretched like taffy. His face had a long, unhealthy look to it, and Clarence was reminded of something his mother had said about his father. He had asked his mother why his dad drank so much, why he did it, even though it made him so mean. But she would always shake her head and tell him that it wasn't his fault. "It's the devil, Clay. The devil lives in those bottles, and it has him. The bottle takes him, and he just can't find his way back." Clarence had always felt guilty about that when he started drinking. He felt like he'd get lost too, and then no one would find him again. He finally felt like he had stumbled into a bottle that he might get trapped inside of. "Why does it do that?" Clarence asked, looking at his own bottle distrustfully. "Do what?" his grandfather said, his voice slurry but having nothing to do with being drunk. His lips were hovering around his chin now, and the skin was slow to bring them up again. "Why does it try to keep you?" His grandpa laughed, and when he drank this time, it sucked half his face inside with it, his skin turning red as he drew it back out, and stretched his flesh like bubblegum. "Oh, the bottle always tries to keep you, boyo. The bottle knows it's nothing without you, so it tries its best to hold you so you can't leave. It's a queer magic about it. It makes you believe that you need it as much as it needs you, and what it takes with it are the ways you might escape it." He held up the bottle, and Clarence saw that what he had mistaken for hops or grit was actually small floating things. At the bottom were coins, like a wishing well, and some of them had things written on them that Clarence could just make out as they shifted. Wealth, life, health, happiness, and completion were all there, but they were only a few among the stack of metal that lay within. "You've left your own wealth at the bottom of a few bottles, I'd wager, haven't you?" "Don't listen to that old gink, son," came a very familiar voice from the stool beside him. Clarence felt his blood run cold, but he resisted the urge to turn and look. The voice had been familiar, but it was the nature of the voice that sent chills up his spine. It sounded as if his father was speaking from the bottom of a well, his voice distorted as it floated from the depths. "The bottle is your treasure, my son. You find solace there. You find comfort there. It dulls the knowledge that you'll never be anything better than what you are. You'll never lead armies, never sail to foreign shores. You'll never command the love of masses, and when they bury you in a pauper's grave, you'll have nothing but pickled memories to follow you down." Clarence turned his head ever so slightly, his neck a rusty hinge in a funhouse attraction, and when he saw his old man, his scream stuck in his throat. His father hadn't lived long past his grandpa, and Clarence had found him dead as well. Clarence had been forced to move back home after Grandpa died. Gramps had left him his house and a sizable inheritance, but Clarence had still been 16 and wasn't able to live on his own yet. He'd been avoiding home, staying at Melinda's house or working long hours, so he was at home as little as possible. But that day he'd had little choice but to come home. He was 17, his birthday only a month away, and he had intended to propose to Melinda and move into his grandpa's house on his birthday. The two would live happily ever after and start a family of their own, and nothing bad would ever happen to them again. How God loves to laugh at our plans sometimes. He'd come in and found his dad on the floor of the living room. He had fallen with a beer bottle in his hand, and it had shattered when he fell face first on the ground. The coroner assumed that he must have fallen mid-sip because he had aspirated broken bottle pieces and died as a result. Clarence hadn't cried for his father, not like he had for his mother or his grandfather, and he had dropped out after burying him and started his new life in his grandpa's house. 4 years later, he had sold it, and he and Melinda had packed up to move to the city so he could find work. They had drunk up or smoked up all his inheritance, and now it was time to go somewhere he could find a job to support himself and his new bride. He had been as optimistic about the move as Melinda had been. They could get a fresh start, a change, something better, but between his drinking and her burgeoning alcoholism, the two were really just moving from one watering hole to another. Looking at him now, Clarence could see the bleeding lips and purple throat from the glass that had cut it. He was slumped over the bar, and at first Clarence thought he was just resting his head against the bottle. It wasn't until he sat up to look at him that he saw his father's head swimming drunkenly inside the glass, his crew cut rubbing against the bottom of the jug as he squinted at his boy. "Your mother told you the bottle had taken me," he said, sounding like a merman in a cartoon. "But I don't think even she knew how true it was." The jug made his purple neck bulge, but it appeared that it too was disappearing into the glass container. Soon his father would be nothing but a living jug, a slave and prisoner to the bottle, and when Clarence pushed off the bar stool, his father reached for him drunkenly. "It's too late, boyo," his grandfather said, and when Clarence looked back, he could see the bottle stretching his face like silly putty as he grinned with a sort of knowing vertigo. "Might as well stop fighting and give in. After all, it's in your blood." Clarence shrugged out of his father's grip before it could turn to iron and went pelting out of the bar at blinding speed. When the smoke again surrounded him, he coughed and swiped at the air as the familiar scent of the street came back to him. He was walking out of the pumpkin mouth, bumping people as they came in, and when the barker approached him, he jumped and looked around as if expecting the specter of his father to be right behind him. "Easy, boyo," the barker said, grinning hideously. "You've come out the other side. Was it everything I told you it would be?" Clarence reached into his pocket before he could stop himself and dropped the 16 or so dollars and crumpled ones into the box. It was all the money he had intended to drink with, and right now he wanted to be rid of it. If he didn't have it, he couldn't drink, and right then he really wanted to be drunk. Thinking of drinking, however, made him remember that strange hell he had been in, and he thought that maybe he had really taken his last drink. "And more," he breathed, excusing himself as he ran back up the street, intent on apologizing to his wife and begging for her forgiveness. They would work the steps. They would get through tonight, and Clarence would have a great story to tell the next time he was in group. Clarence might even recommend the haunted house to a few of his friends in the group who were having trouble with sobriety. The fun house had been better than 6 months of AA, better by a long shot. Barker smiled at the man's back as he hurried up the road to whatever hole he had scuttled from. Another satisfied customer. Truly a wonderful time spent in the Barker's haunted house. We'll have a little bit more from him tomorrow, but now I think we're going to go to a couple of unnamed tales. First, we're going to take a little ride with a strange chauffeur as we hear about the passenger. I don't drive, so a big part of my daily back and forth is calling and using Uber. This sounds pretty mundane, but today's trip was anything but normal. I had been out late and decided to Uber myself home instead of trying to get a cab. I have nothing against cabs, but you never know who you're going to find when you're out riding in the big yellow. I like Uber because I feel like they vet their guys a little better. That's probably incorrect, but I've yet to get a bad Uber experience until tonight. My friends tell me all the time that they have terrible experiences with the service, but I have yet to get a creep and was feeling pretty good when I put in the address at around 11:30 to be picked up. The app took in my information, chewed it over, and I received a message that said M was coming to pick me up. Took me a few minutes to figure out that this was a little abnormal. I looked at it for a minute, not sure I'd seen it right. There was almost always a full name when you got an Uber. Usually, it's with a picture attached, but this was just a letter with no picture. I started to cancel the ride, but then I felt a little silly for getting rattled. It was just a different kind of profile. The guy would show up and be as normal as anybody else, and I'd make it home in time to get a shower and head to bed before midnight. I gave it about 10 minutes, and just as my finger had started to hover over the cancel button, a large, black Lincoln Town car pulled up to the curb. It wasn't what I was expecting, but when I looked at the vehicle description, I saw that that was blank too, so I supposed I was in for a surprise. Who knew? Maybe it was just somebody pulling a Halloween prank, and I'd have something funny to talk about on the internet with strangers. It was October, and I was getting used to seeing spooky encounters on my TikTok and YouTube shorts. As the car came to a stop, the door popped open on its own. I expected a creepy voice to tell me that my ride was here, but the inside was as silent as a grave. Now, I was pretty sure that it was a Halloween prank. It was a couple of days before, and it sounded like somebody had decided to get a little festive. This would definitely be something I could tell my friends about the next day, so I just shrugged and climbed in. The door closed as I got in, and we headed towards my apartment. "So," I asked, "have the fares been pretty good tonight?" I expected the creepy voice to come then, but there was nothing. The man behind the wheel just drove, taking turns as they came. The cab of the car was dark, and I could see his eyes reflected in the rearview mirror. I didn't linger on them. They were bloodshot and not altogether healthy looking. They stared unerringly at me in the rearview mirror, and I wondered how he could drive so well while not looking at the road. I looked behind the seat because sometimes you get a little information card down there, but there was nothing but the little pocket that sits behind most seats. I didn't feel like I was in danger or anything. This was still just someone's idea of a joke, and I suppose I would get a little spooked, and then he would laugh and tell me it would all been a prank. That's how it seemed to work these days. Everybody had their phones out and was pulling little pranks on each other. And I supposed by the end of the night I'd be on someone's YouTube channel. If he didn't want to talk, I supposed I'd just sit quietly and say nothing. The longer we drove, the harder it became to maintain. I kept looking back at the rearview mirror, looking at his eyes as they stared at me with such intensity. It was impossible not to notice. They never budged, and the man didn't seem to blink. I tried to look out the window, tried to look at anything besides that little mirror, but the longer the ride went on, the more difficult it became to look away. Weren't particularly nice, but they were almost mesmerizing in their otherworldliness. I could see every vein that stood out in the whiteness of that orb. could see the little wrinkles at the corners of his eyes. I could see the bags as they sat under them, and I could even see a little mark just at the corner of the left bag. I tried to make myself look away, but my eyes kept coming back to his, like a bird trapped by a snake. The longer I looked at his eyes, the more sure I was that I was not going to make it to my destination. I couldn't have said why. I had no reason to think that he was trying to kidnap me or something, but as the turns went on and on, a ride that should have taken 10 minutes seemed to take an hour and then 2. I found myself focusing on those bloodshot eyes more and more as the silence stretched on, and I could feel my teeth trying to clack together. Why was he staring at me? Did he want something from me? Was he going to hurt me? The longer I thought about it, the less I found I wanted to know. I thought about grabbing for the door handle and making my escape, but my hands were frozen in my lap as they sat over my purse. I wanted to ask him why he was staring and what he expected of me, but my lips were frozen together as the sense of horror grated on me. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. And I felt certain that by the next day I'd be nothing but a squib in the paper. They'd find me in an alley or something, my eyes wide with the fear after my heart had simply stopped, and then no one would know what had happened to me. I tried to shake my head and tell myself I was being ridiculous, but the longer I looked into his eyes, the more sure I was of his intention. I was going to die. I was going to die. I was going to die. The words kept rattling around in my skull like a trapped bird. And when I turned my eyes to look out the window, I suddenly discovered that we weren't in the city anymore. We were heading up unfamiliar streets, and the driver was taking turns seemingly at random. I wasn't even sure he knew where he was going anymore, and each turn made me want to begin screaming all over again. I wanted to pound on the door and tell him he had to stop. I wanted to be out of here. I wanted to be anywhere but here, and I suddenly knew that I'd never take a ride from anyone I didn't know ever again. My parents always told me not to take rides from strangers, and this was just more of that, wasn't it? I was in the car with someone I didn't know, and their eyes were boring into me like they knew all my secrets and all my sins, and it went on like that for some undetermined amount of time as I sat and prayed that I would one day be able to return home and know peace again. Suddenly, he was going faster. He increased to 40, then 50, then 60, then 70, and then he was taking those turns at a speed like something out of a carnival ride. He was going so fast that there was no way he could have known whether he would make the turn or not. Every time he took a turn, I thought, he's going to crash into something, and every turn, we just kept going, just as we had before. I found myself clutching my hands as they lay on my purse, and I was praying in my mind for all this to stop. I'd had enough. I wanted to be off, whatever this was. And I closed my eyes as I felt soft, muffled words come stabbing out of me. Stop! Please, stop! He slammed his foot on the brakes, and I shut my eyes as if expecting to feel the impact. We were going to crash now, and I'd be all over the inside of his vehicle instead of an alley. We'd smash into something and die, and then I opened my eyes, and we were suddenly in front of my apartment. The door was open, and it appeared I was free to go. I looked at the dark miasma where the driver sat, and before I could stop myself, I thanked him. I feel foolish for it now, but I was thankful. I thought for sure I was going to die, and that no one would ever be the wiser. But instead, I'd been allowed to live, and that was something worth celebrating. I got out of the town car, making sure I got my purse, and as it rolled away, I felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of happiness. It appeared that I was right, because as I sit here now, I'm sharing this with strangers. I was hesitant to tell people. Some of you might actually seek out this stranger and his otherworldly Uber. But if you do, at least you know the experience is worth the price tag. I've yet to be charged for whatever strange cab service that was. And I'm not sure I'll ever sign up for something like that again. After what I experienced tonight, I think I may be a little less picky about taking a cab. One more story for you, and I think I've got a pretty good one to close us out on. We all love a good roadside attraction, but sometimes those roadside carnivals get a little bit dangerous. So, let's us hear a story about a roadside carnival. Bailey seemed like the perfect girl, a real angel sent from above. I met Bailey at the farmer's market. She was selling homemade soaps and dancing around in a dress that looked like it might have started life as a pair of curtains. I was selling eggs and vegetables, something I did pretty regularly on the weekends, and she took to me right away. Next week, when I came back, she set her stall up next to mine, and I guess we really hit it off. After that, we began dating, sort of. Bailey never really used labels. She said they were restraining. She preferred to call us partners, and I have to say, she really broadened my horizons. I was used to my dates being at the local steakhouse or at the creek while I fished, but Bailey was into nature walks and making stuff. We spent evenings making soap and candles, and we would take edibles and go on long walks, and sometimes we just drive for hours listening to music or talking about old times. Most of it was just us enjoying each other's company. Bailey was very adventurous, and it was nice to get out and see things that I probably wouldn't have sought out on my own. 2 months after meeting, Bailey was living with me as well. Bailey didn't have a lot, just a pull-along trailer and a lot of materials for making things, and it all fit pretty snugly in my garage. We spent a lot of our time just tooling around, seeing the sights and doing whatever we liked. It was nice, but I learned one thing about Bailey very quickly. Bailey was impetuous and prone to flights of fancy. It didn't matter where we were going or what we were doing. If Bailey saw it, and she wanted to have a closer look at it, we were stopping. We've stopped at too many farmers' markets to count, multiple yard sales, and she stopped me on the way to my cousin's funeral so we could check out what amounted to a tourist trap. I didn't really mind. We were the best-dressed pair at the state's largest totem pole. It was fun, going on our little adventures. Sometimes we mixed these with substances that led them to be hazy when I tried to remember them, but a lot of the time we were just out enjoying each other's company, and that made it all worthwhile. It happened one afternoon while we were driving, as so many things usually did. I was telling Bailey a story about my childhood, and she laughed suddenly, which made me ask her what was so funny. "It's so you, Mike." "Me?" I asked, not really getting it. "What's me? I swear I don't know how you lived before me. All your stories just seem to be doing normal things. Haven't you ever done anything impetuous before? Didn't you ever go on an adventure before I came along?" "Well, of course we did," I said a little defensively. "We went out and did things, and saw stuff, and did all sorts of—" "I don't mean like a vacation," she said, and it almost sounded disdainful. "I mean like, just went and did things because you felt like it. Like, just stopped to eat at a roadside diner because the exterior looked cool, or went to a state park you were passing just because you wanted to see what it looked like inside." I thought about it and shook my head for a moment. No, I guess we never did. My parents were kind of generic, I suppose, and we just never really did stuff like that. "Well, how about it? Are you ready for a real adventure?" I laughed. Haven't we gone on enough adventures yet? We seem to go on adventures all the time. She smirked, and as usual, it was equal parts amusement and disdain. I mean like a real adventure. I'm not talking about a safe adventure like a farmer's market or a garage sale. I'm talking about somewhere you're not sure if you'll come back from at the end of the day. I'm talking about a real Tolkien adventure with elves and orcs and strange food, the whole shebang. I had to think about that for a minute. I'd always played it safe. I didn't eat at weird restaurants or stop at places where I didn't know the crowd, and it always kept me safe. Hanging out with Bailey, though, showed me that I might have been a little too locked into my habits, and maybe it was time to try something a little different. Maybe, like Bilbo before me, it was time to go on a real adventure. And just where are we supposed to find this adventure? Bailey gave me this odd look, like a cat contemplating how best to get a rat. And when she pointed at a side road off to the left, I realized she'd been planning this all along. Take that road for about a mile, and then I'll let you know where we go from there. Where are we? But she held up a hand and silenced me. No questions. We're on an adventure, remember? It was about lunchtime when we started out, the two of us planning to go down to Dolly's for hamburgers and fries, but it was nearly 5 o'clock when she said we were getting close. We'd stopped for gas about an hour before I saw it, and Bailey still wouldn't answer any questions about the destination. I didn't know what we were getting close to, but when I saw the handmade sign for a roadside carnival, I figured that was our destination. It was August. The roadside carnivals were at a premium right now, it seemed. Most of them put ads in the circular, though, and didn't just leave signs on a half-abandoned roadway in the hopes that people would find them. I started to protest, but she reminded me we were on an adventure, and adventures were rarely scheduled. We pulled up outside this little cow pasture, maybe 30 acres in all, and it was amazing what they had managed to do with so little space. It was like the carnivals I remembered from when I was a kid. It was one of those haphazard roadside attractions that you sometimes see thrown up out of nowhere. There were little tents with curiosities in them, a small corral for some malnourished animals, and a few rides with that barely hanging on sort of look about them. The whole place looked like it had just appeared out of some health department officer's fever dream. And as I killed the engine, the look on my face must have been far from enthusiasm. "What?" Bailey asked. If you just wanted to go to a carnival, there's half a dozen of them around here we could have gone to. We needn't have gone so far from home." "Those are safe carnivals," she said with a wink. "These carnivals aren't like the ones you'll find off Main Street. These carnivals are the kind you find in internet posts and Reddit stories. These carnivals can get a little out of your comfort zone, but they're always tons of fun. You're coming, right? Or are you going to be an old fuddy-duddy?" I didn't want her to think of me as some old fossil, so I told her I would go, and off we went. Probably should have been a little bit suspicious, but there didn't seem to be any reason to. Bailey had never really struck me as the dangerous type, and I didn't think that she would get into any trouble that we couldn't get back out of. The carnival was exactly as run down as I had feared it would be. The rides made noise like they were just barely working. The animals looked like they might have mange, and the curiosities seemed more like badly done taxidermy. It all seemed very held together by shoe leather and happy thoughts. The carnival workers were just as disreputable looking as the fair, and they were more orcs than elves, it seemed. All of them were missing teeth, and more than a few of them seemed to be missing fingers. They all leered like they couldn't wait to get a look at our cash, and I found myself clutching Bailey a little tighter than I strictly needed to. I was not opposed to having a little fun, but this was a lot outside of my comfort zone. These people could be criminals, and we were just getting ready to walk in, and I looked down at Bailey, and it was like she could read my mind, and did not approve of what she saw there. I buried my misgivings, and started trying my best to have a good time. We rode some rides, and had some fair food, but the longer we stayed, the more things stood out. What made me nervous was the way the carnival people kept looking at Bailey. They didn't leer so much as they looked at her the way you look at people when you know them or recognize them. They smiled a little too big, and their hellos were loaded with understanding. I know how that sounds. It sounds paranoid as hell, but I was starting to feel a little paranoid. It felt like they had expected us, and I wasn't sure these were the kind of people I wanted to be expected by. Bailey just kept telling me to relax and have fun. She even offered me edibles to calm me down, which I refused. The longer it went on, the more my senses started tingling, telling me that something wasn't right here. I wanted to go home, but I wasn't going to be the one to break first either. Bailey had made it pretty clear that she thought I was a stick in the mud, and I didn't want to prove it by getting goosey over some offhanded looks. By about 8 o'clock, my back hurt and I was ready to go home. I told Bailey as much, and she begged for just a little bit more time. She said she hadn't been to one of these carnivals in a long time, and she just wanted to hang out for a little while longer. I told her I was ready to go, and I could see it on her face that she wanted to call me an old man and ask if it was past my bedtime. I finally told her that I needed to go to the bathroom and that I was going to go look for a porta potty. Bailey rolled her eyes, clearly having guessed that I was uncomfortable, and I went searching for a toilet while she went searching for more adventure. Thank God I did, or I might not have made it out. I was sitting in the porta potty, pants around my ankles, as I tried to figure out what I was going to do, and that's when I heard them. I didn't know them, but I assumed they were carnies. That might be an unfair assumption, but they just sort of sounded like carnival folk. They had thick accents and seemed to be discussing some event that was coming up. I didn't have a lot else to listen to, so I craned my neck and tried to hear what they were discussing. "How much longer until we spring it?" one of them asked. "You know as well as I do how this works," the other one said. "They have a good time, they ride the rides, they eat the fair food, then we spring it on them. By then, they're too tired and full to do anything. That's how we always get them. That's how we've always got them. And if it ain't broke, we ain't likely to fix it. He don't look like he's gonna put up any fight no ways. He's big enough, but he look plain as milk. I doubt he even struggles before we..." But they moved off then, and I lost the rest of the conversation. My blood ran cold. Sounded like these guys were getting ready to rob us. Or worse. Who knew what they had planned, and I realized that I had left Bailey unattended. They might have hurt her while I was gone, and that thought had me hiking up my pants and heading back into the carnival. It wasn't until then that I realized how few people there were at this thing, and how most of them looked like the same carnival folks that I had just heard discussing our fate. If there were any other passers-by here, then I didn't see them. That didn't bode well, and I was more intent than ever on leaving. I started looking for Bailey amongst the crowd, but I couldn't seem to find her. All the people here were smiling a little too big as they watched me pass, and it was weird to be the focus of that much attention. You know how you can feel it when someone's eyes are on you? Well, that's how I felt, and I didn't much care for it. It was unsettling. It made me think that more than a couple of them might be in on the scheme. I was coming through the midway when I saw a group of them, the lead man pointing at me as they made a beeline for me. There were 6 of them, 2 of them big old bruisers and the kind of thing Teamsters used to wear on mob shows. They were making their approach, trying to look casual, but it was all too apparent who they were coming for. Maybe they'd already gotten Bailey, but I wasn't going to do her any good if they got me, too. I ducked between two stalls, keeping my head low, as I tried to get somewhere a little more public. That was made all the harder by the fact that no one else seemed to be here. It was like trying to blend in an empty field, and I finally ducked behind one of the abandoned Midway booths and tried my best not to be seen. I must have done a pretty good job of it, because the group went by with a lot of dark mumbling and more than a few glances to see how I had eluded them. I had just thought about standing up when I heard an all too familiar voice, and was glad that I hadn't. "We lost him," said a deep, raspy voice. "I told you guys not to lose him," Bailey said, and hearing her talk about me like that made my neck hurt. "I've spent the better part of 3 months getting him on the hook, and all you guys had to do was grab him when he got out of the bathroom." "He can't have gone far. We find him," said the gravelly voice. "You'd better. The ritual is in 3 hours, and there'll be hell to pay if we don't have one." They moved away, and I was left sitting there, wondering just who I'd been dating for the last 3 months. What ritual were they talking about? What sort of people were they? I thought they all seemed a little too friendly with Bailey, and now it made sense. If this had all been some kind of elaborate ruse, then I'd fallen for it, hook, line, and sinker. I had to get out of here. I had to get away before they were able to do whatever it was they were planning to do. A quick peek up over the stall showed me that there were only a few carnies at the end of the Midway, and they weren't looking in my direction. I stayed low and started making my way around the side of the booth so that I wouldn't get noticed. Most of them seemed too intent on looking for me, and I wasn't there to be seen. I made it a pretty good distance before I finally got spotted. I had come out near the concession stand, smelling the fried Oreos and funnel cake, and that was when somebody yelled and said they had found me. "There he is! I found him!" That seemed to fill me with adrenaline, and finally I was running for my life. I had to make it to the parking lot. I had to make it to the truck. I had to get out of here while there was still an out of here to get to. Some of the bigger carnival guys tried to block my way, but I juked around them and kept running. The sounds and smells of the carnival were jarringly nauseating at this point. They all whipped past me like a frantic merry-go-round, and I wasn't sure I was ever going to make it out. It all seemed like a little kid's nightmare more than anything, and every time I thought I had made it away, another one came looming up out of nowhere to block my path. For such a small carnival, there seemed to be nearly a limitless supply of carnies, and I rejoiced when I saw the exit looming up as I passed a scrambler that was on the edge of the campground. The gate was made of flimsy-looking wood, but the ticket taker, a man we had paid to get into this place, was wide enough to block it with his body. I didn't think I was going to make it through him. I didn't think there was any way, but when I hit him squarely with my shoulder, something I hadn't done since high school, I bowled right over the top of him and just kept going. I made it to my car and was thankful that I hadn't locked it. I got in the driver's seat and crammed the keys into the ignition, expecting them to start hammering on my truck at any moment. I expected them to just pick the truck up and move it. Some of them were big enough to do that, but they didn't. They didn't even touch the truck. And as I looked up at the carnival before screeching out of their little makeshift parking lot, I saw why. They were all arrayed around the rim of the carnival, just watching me from a distance of about 50 feet. They stood like worshippers in a church, waiting for the preacher to come back. Bailey was among them, looking disappointed but not angry. Her eyes seemed to tell me that I'd be back, and that was the last I saw of her as I went blaring out of the parking lot, back towards home. I was glad I had paid attention on the way in. Otherwise, I might not have made it. It took me a little while to get back, but I've never been so happy to see my home as I was when I finally came into my front yard. I went inside, and it took me about 20 minutes to stop my hands from shaking so I could call the police. I told the sheriff what had happened. I didn't know if he believed me, but he agreed to go look into it. The sheriff and I had known each other for quite a while, and I think he knew enough to trust my judgment, and that I wouldn't make up a story for no reason. He said that he'd go have a look, and that if he found anything, he'd let me know, and I had to be content with that for the moment. He came back to me that night. It seemed that maybe he believed me at least a little bit. It also seemed like maybe he'd seen something out there that made him a little bit glad that he hadn't been the subject of my story. "We found something. It's not a carnival, but it's something. Seems like they left it all there. There were rides and lights still going. You could smell all the stuff frying, even after they put out the fires for the night. There was nobody there, not a soul, but all of us felt like somebody was watching us. Wherever they went to, they went in a hurry. We also found some other things that led us to believe you might not be far off from the sacrifice angle. There were clothes in one of the tents, clothes and wallets that had been stripped of cash, but not of identification. Some of those IDs are for people in the database. Some of them have been missing for a good long time. If your Bailey calls back again, let us know. We'd like to have a word with her about the company she's been keeping." I told him I would, but who knows if I'll still be alive to call in the morning. Bailey has a key to my house. She knows where I live, and quite a few of her things are still here. Who's to say she might not decide to come back anyway and see if her sacrifice is still here? I don't know. Maybe it was all just an act or a goof, but if you find yourself being courted by a strange woman who tries to lead you into adventure, be very wary. I don't know what or who they were trying to sacrifice me to, but it sounds like they might need another one very soon. And just like that, our tales are at an end for another day. But don't you fret, we'll have lots more cozy horror to come as the week goes on. Until then, this is Dr. Plague wishing you a wonderful day and a spooky evening.